welcome to Strange Brew MTG, a casual deck building channel for Magic the Gathering and Commander. In this video, I wanted to highlight some maybe underrated or underplayed cards in Commander, stuff that I think can fit into a lot of different types of decks, but maybe are overlooked just because they aren't as popular as the regular Commander staples or just lesser known cards. These are cards that I think can generate a lot of value despite having downsides, or if they're put into the right deck, their downsides can really become upsides. So I call this list of underrated cards just strange ingredients to brew Commander decks with. The first card is Animal Magnetism. It's a 5-mana sorcery, 4 and a green. It reads, reveal the top 5 cards of your library. An opponent chooses a creature card among them and put that card into play, and the rest into your graveyard. Currently, according to EDHREC, this card is ran in only about 50 decks. Now, I find that kind of weird just because effects like this, where you give an opponent a choice, aren't completely unheard of in Commander. A perfect example of this is a card like Fact or Fiction. 3 and a blue instant, reveal the top 5 cards of your library. An opponent separates those cards into 2 piles, put one into your hand and the other into your graveyard. Now, by comparison, Fact or Fiction is the better card, but in the right deck, the downside of Animal Magnetism can definitely become an upside. In decks like Muldrotha, where it doesn't really matter what else goes into your graveyard just because you have Muldrotha to get it back, and you have the odds of cheating out a creature. Or a deck like Kethis, where you want to fill your graveyard with a bunch of legendaries. Or any really graveyard deck like Marin or all the popular Golgari commanders. And a lot of these decks use abilities and effects that arrange the top of their libraries, like Sensei's Divining Top, Sylvan Library, or just using the Scry ability. So making sure you hit a creature among the top 5 cards of your deck isn't really that hard. There are also just a lot of cards that benefit from filling your graveyard, whether it's trying to achieve Delirium for a certain card, or having enough cards to activate an escape card in your deck, or just to reach the amount of cards for Threshold. And you also get to cheat out a creature at the same time as filling your graveyard. Now, this card does have a decent amount going against it. It is 5 mana, it is sorcery speed, but sometimes you just really need to fill that graveyard, and this is just an extra way to do that. And even though an opponent chooses the creature card among those cards, I think it opens discussion for politics with these types of cards. Now, the opponent may have a little bit more of the leverage just because they get to choose the creature, but 9 times out of 10, you're not going to be putting too many creatures in your deck that aren't going to benefit you or your deck strategy in any way. This card is also very budget friendly, and this card is just kind of an interesting inclusion to a lot of graveyard decks, just because you're cheating out a creature, but it's under an opponent's choice, so it adds that bit of politics to it. I just think that this kind of card makes for more interesting games. Another card on this strange ingredients list that goes well with Animal Magnetism or just in any of those graveyard decks that I just talked about is Hunting Grounds. It's a 2-mana enchantment, just 1 green, 1 white, and it reads, whenever an opponent plays a spell, you may put a creature card from your hand into play. But you have to have Threshold, which means you just need 7 or more cards in your graveyard for this ability to take effect. Now, I run this card in my own Kethis the Hidden Hand deck, as it's a great way to cheat out creatures, and the deck itself is already trying to fill the graveyard. So Threshold is just a great option to look into for a lot of graveyard decks. Another reason I like this card is that it's in green and white, which are colors that don't normally care about graveyards too much. But again, in the right deck, this card can generate a ton of value. Creature-heavy decks like Mael, the Anima, or Samut, Voice of Dissent, they can benefit from running this card just because it's pretty decent mid to late game if you're not running a bunch of graveyard strategies. But if you are, this card is definitely a card to consider. According to EDHREC, this card is currently only in about 815 decks. Just 1% of the decks that it could be ran in. Now, the price of this card isn't very budget friendly, but it's an interesting card that I don't see a lot in Commander games that I think fits really well in a lot of different types of decks. In my opinion, though, it's worth considering picking up if you're running a graveyard deck or a really creature-heavy deck that needs help cheating stuff out late game. A card that I think is super interesting that sees next to no play at all is Arboria. It's a world enchantment that costs 2 and 2 green, and it reads, creatures can't attack a player unless that player casts a spell or put a non-token permanent onto the battlefield during their last turn. Now, there are a lot of ways to work around the downsides of this card. Decks that want to cast things at instant speed, for instance. The decks that heavily rely on cards like Vidalcan Orrery or Leyline of Anticipation. Decks that run cards like Teferi, Mage of Zalfir, or Yiva, Nature's Herald. I used to have a Rashmi Eternity's Crafter deck that was all about casting things on my opponent's turns to gain benefits off of Rashmi. So this card kind of fits very well in decks like that. But the fact that this is a world enchantment makes this card really interesting to me, just because your opponents can choose not to cast anything so that they won't get swung at on the next turn. And I think one of the more interesting uses for this card that I came up with was putting it in a werewolf deck. A lot of times when you're playing werewolves, you'll opt to not play anything so that your werewolves can transform. And this ensures that no one attacks you afterwards, but it may also convince your opponents not to cast anything, so that way your werewolves can stay transformed. I think there's a fair amount of flexibility in this card that you can almost choose when it is active or not for yourself, just simply by casting a permanent. Again, this is definitely not a budget-friendly card, but it's a card worth considering just because it has such a unique effect, kind of giving the whole table a pillow fort option if they need it. Another underplayed card, in my opinion, is Growth Spasm. It's a 3-mana sorcery, 2 and a green. Search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. Create a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature token. It has sacrifice this creature, add colorless mana. Now, I think this card gives you a lot for only 3 mana. You get a land onto the battlefield, so it helps with ramp and fixing, as well as a creature that you can block with, but that creature also sacrifices for mana. And because you're technically up 1 mana with that Eldrazi spawn, this spell essentially costs the same as a Rampant Growth when you think about it. I think this card fits best in token decks or decks that want to sacrifice creatures, just because in those types of decks, this card is now pretty decent mid to late game. While in comparison to like a Rampant Growth or a Cultivate or Kodama's Reach, those don't give you as much value late game. Currently, EDH Rec says this card is in about 1% of the decks listed. This is a great budget ramp option at only 25 cents, and I'm kind of surprised I don't see it in more Commander games. Another card that I'm surprised I don't see more play in Commander games is Altar of Bone. Altar of Bone is a 2-mana sorcery, 1 white, 1 green. It says, as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature. Search your library for a creature card, reveal it, put it in your hand, and then shuffle. According to EDH Rec, this card is only played in 961 decks. That's only 1% of the decks it could be played in. Now, despite losing in comparison to cards like Eladamri's Call, which tutors any creature to your hand without any downside, and its instant speed, or a card like Natural Order, which is similar but tutors a creature onto the field with a condition that both the sacrifice creature and the creature tutored for are both green. Altar of Bone is another card that I think benefits certain kinds of decks, like graveyard decks, that heavily benefit from cards going into your graveyard. Cards that run, Fauna Shaman should run this as well, as long as you're in the colors. I think it's fairly easy to see the benefit of this card getting dies triggers or leave the battlefield triggers, where the graveyard is almost an extension of the cards in your hand. Speaking of Fauna Shaman, another underrated card for graveyard decks is Silverglade Pathfinder. It reads somewhat similar to Fauna Shaman. It's 1 and a green for a 1/1 creature that has pay 1 and a green, tap, discard a card, search your library for a basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. If you think about it, this card essentially turns any card from your hand into a Rampant Growth, except if this creature stays out, you can do it at instant speed. This is a card that I recently found out existed, but it surprises me that I haven't seen it played before in anyone else's decks. I'm definitely going to try to find spaces in decks that I already have. I think it's great ramp, I think it's great fixing, and its price is around $0.25, so really can't beat that. And the last card I'll talk about on this list is a strange card called Withering Boon. 1 and a black for an instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, pay 3 life. Counter target creature spell. Yes, a black counter spell. I run this card in my Minotaur deck. I do love playing this card, countering someone's spell in black and red, and just people not seeing it coming. It had kind of a cooler effect, I think, before Tybalt's Trickery was printed. Just because now that red has a counterspell, if I leave 2 mana open while I'm playing a red and black deck, some people do actually think maybe I have a counterspell that I'm holding up. But a lot of people don't see this coming in black decks. The additional cost of 3 life is really nothing in a game of Commander, and for this effect of countering a spell, I think is pretty decent. EDH Rec currently has this card in about 1% of decks that it could be ran in. I think the main reason that this is an underrated card is, I mean, honestly, black has a lot of creature removal, so a creature counterspell isn't really needed. But I do like that instead of just removing the creature from the table, you're removing it from the stack. So that way, you know, the creature doesn't have an ETB, it won't trigger anything. And again, a lot of people never see this one coming. So I think that'll be it for this episode. Hopefully you discovered a new card in the world of Magic, or maybe thought about a card differently. Let me know in the comments what you think of these cards, or if you have a suggestion for another Strange Ingredients episode. Hopefully I'll be able to do some more deck tech soon. But yeah, I guess that's it. Thanks again, and oh yeah, I do keep forgetting to say smash all the buttons and subscribe to all the things. Yeah, have a great day.